Dear Phyllis, dear Mirko, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and honor to be at CCA. It's a great pleasure for me to be back at CCA. And thanks so much for the invitation for this exhibition. We feel very welcome here and in an excellent environment, and we'll now try to lead you through this project. Last summer, we launched an unusual research project in the framework of the Future Cities Laboratory of the Singapore ETH Center in Singapore, and thanks to a generous 5-year research grant by the National Research Foundation of Singapore, we started an inquiry that is leading us in a series of expeditions to 17 volcanoes on the Indonesian island of Java. Our team of 7 is a group of architects, historians, and artists based in Zurich and Singapore. Besides Alex and myself, it comprises the architect Adrian Jürgensen, the architect historian Sebastian Linsin, and the artist collective U5 with Martin Kunz, Stefanie Rubner, and Berit Seidel. Our guide is Franz Wilhelm Junghun, a German-Dutch explorer who lived in Java between 1835 and his death in 1864. We follow his footsteps and visit his favorite volcanoes.
Also a warm hello from me. So Franz Wilhelm Junghun is hardly known outside the Netherlands and Indonesia. Born in central Germany and trained as a doctor in Berlin, his dream has always been to be an explorer, just like his idol, the famous Prussian explorer and writer Alexander von Humboldt. In 1835, in his early 20s, he sailed to the island of Java in the service of the Dutch authorities. He served in Java as a military doctor, but soon started to explore the landscape and was mainly interested in vegetation and geology. The Dutch decided that he was more useful if he sent them information about natural resources and sponsored, therefore, his research. It led him through almost the entire island of Java, as well as to Sumatra and Bali. He was particularly fascinated by the island's many volcanoes and climbed over 40 of them, measured their heights, their geological composition, drew the craters, reconstructed early eruptions by examining their debris. He interviewed locals about the history of the volcanoes and collected written sources from earlier expeditions. He sent his sketches to Germany, where he successfully published a series of plates and descriptions in 1845.
After more than a decade in the hot and humid climate of Java, Junghun fell seriously ill. His employers granted him a trip back to Europe to recover in the cooler climate of Germany and the Netherlands. He traveled back in the revolution year of 1848 and remained in Europe for 7 years. During his stay, mainly in Leiden, he wrote a monumental 3-volume book on Java, with particularly emphasis on the volcanoes, and published his masterpiece, the first accurate map of the island of Java, a map that would remain used until the late 19th century. Unlike the earlier maps, for instance, the map by Raffles, it was not conceived from without, from the coastline, but from within, from the perspectives of the volcanoes, so to speak. He was among the first to understand the volcanoes as phenomenon that virtually made the land, brought fertility and well-being to the environment. He drew them in a way similar to the depiction of gigantic buildings in plans and elevations, but also in rapidly made sketches of certain details. For architects, these drawings are particularly appealing as they look familiar. Often he draws himself into the sketches as a kind of very early selfie in order to show the scale, but also in order to allow us to locate him as an explorer within the land. He accompanied the map with an elevation depicting all the volcanoes of Java in one row. This image, more than any other, struck us during the preparation. It reminded us of a musical score, a fever curve, a procession of animals, but also a skyline in a huge metropolis. We would not be able to visit them all, we thought, but we also wanted to see more than just one or two of them. So 17 seemed a good number, and we decided to give us the task to visit them in a series of expeditions from Singapore. So Java, in some sense, became our Manhattan, and the 17 volcanoes turned into 17 skyscrapers.
So we decided to structure our project in a series of expeditions. I know it's a little bit of a presumptuous word, that led us from Singapore to Java. The rule we gave ourselves is that every place we visit should have been visited by Jung Hoon before. We take his detailed descriptions, his lithographs and photographs as points of orientation. Since January 15, we made 8 expeditions so far. So far, we visited 14 volcanoes, and we are planning to make one further expedition next summer and climb 3 more. We are accompanied by the artists Bas Prinsen and Armin Linke, the artist collective U5, the volcanologist Clive Oppenheimer, the literary historian Elizabeth Bronfen, as well as the Indonesian linguist and photographer Denny Sungandi, who has become our guide. Each expedition is organized as a kind of mobile conference. Instead of meeting in an air-conditioned room and presenting slides, we meet in situ, walking and talking together during a couple of days, waiting for hours in traffic, unfortunately, in Java, hoping for good weather, sometimes losing our way in the rain or in the dark, sleepless because of jet lag and the muezzin prayers at 3 a.m.
So the artists that are joining us, they do more than merely documenting what we see. Their works, their images are informing our project. The very first expedition in January 2015 took us to the place where Jung Hoon spent most of his life and also died, the city of Bandung. And we were somewhat disappointed that Kawah Putih, the famous white crater that he had described so vividly and that is open for tourism since the 1980s, Kawah Putih was hardly visible in the fog because of the rain season. Only after our return to Zurich, Bas Prinsen sent us this photograph that he entitled Volcano Walk. It's in the exhibition here. It depicts the crater of Kawah Putih with the bushes and trees turned black because of the sulfurous air. It reminded us of the paintings of romantic artists such as Caspar David Friedrich, and it put the emphasis on the atmosphere of the site. From that moment on, we knew that the encounter with the crater was becoming the guideline of the project. So the photographs by Prinsen relate primarily to the more pictorial part of Jung Hoon's oeuvre, as Jung Hoon was popular for the spectacular lithographs that circulated in the second half of the 19th century. Prinsen's images evoke, next please, the encounter with the sites, the unexpected colors of plants that one can find in volcanic areas, the specificity of light and shadow, and the peculiar atmosphere.
So Armin Linke, on the other hand, mainly refers to the analytic approach and the scientific work by Jung Hoon. He is interested in the institutional context. For instance, the Geological Museum in Bandung, where we found some specimens of Jung Hoon's original fossil collection. In his video and photographs, we learn about the way volcanoes are monitored today and see how geologists look at screens rather than the actual mountain. Tangkuban Perahu a double crater near Bandung that was cherished by Jung-hoon and depicted in several photographs by himself, continues to have smaller eruptions today, is interesting for him through the eyes of the monitors which are located in the observatory nearby. The differing views were striking during our expedition to Il Ijin crater in January. The crater is known for its sulfur mining and its spectacular sulfur lake. The artists were standing back to back, literally back to back. Prinsen capturing the atmospheric effects of the lake, while Linke, with his assistant Julia Bruno, was only seizing the conditions of the sulfur miners. So it's a perfect share of labor. The aim of our project is not solely to know more about our fascinating and half-forgotten explorer of the 19th century. Our perspective is architectural, and we are addressing the architectural community. At least we hope so. We intend to reactivate the current discussion about the topic of the urban, which in our view has lost its momentum somehow. We want to bring into play new concepts and new associations, and we want to propose a kind of perspectival shift in that area of research.
So, why volcanoes? As giant figures in the landscape, they are deeply rooted in the economical, political, and cultural life of Java. They created parts of the land and continuously transform it. The potential destructiveness, for instance, of Gunung Merapi, that last erupted in 2010, is overwhelming. Yet the volcanoes also shape the land and feed the people by producing fertile grounds and building material for one of the world's most densely populated areas. Java, the main island of Indonesia, has 140 million inhabitants at about the size of Cuba. Volcanoes, we think, cannot be considered landscape. Adyat Sudradyat, the doyen of Javanese volcanology, told us that he is particularly interested in Merapi because he, as he says it, communicates. First, we thought that this is a research project for professors and doctoral students only, and that it was not something to involve teaching, but our students said, no, we want to follow and we want to participate. So 30 of them came to Java, despite our warning that they would have to climb the most dangerous volcano with us, and climbed Merapi in last October. The feedback by the students was essential, as they immediately saw that the spatiality and materiality of Merapi was closer to a built structure than to the mountains that they know from Switzerland. So the description by the students of the glass-like texture and the sounds of the ground while you're walking over Merapi was not so different from what Jung-hoon had written 1.5 centuries ago.
So the volcanoes are objects with distinct qualities. They are kind of personalities for us. They remain silent for a while and suddenly start to speak again. We witnessed this in January this year when we were present at the eruption of Mount Bromo. Prinsen wanted to go there for many years, since he had discovered a late 19th century panorama in an antiquarian shop in Holland. The Sea of Sand, a gigantic caldera, is one of the most cherished tourist attractions in East Java. The villages are built right to the rim of the caldera, and hundreds of people owe their living to the volcano. We are so glad that he woke up again, one of the vendors told us, who is selling coffee to visitors. By encountering Jung-hoon's favorite volcanoes, we converse with each of them as well. The closer we get to them, the clearer we perceive their singularity. Mount Guntur, that we climbed in June, is silent, but the volcanologist is highly worried about increase of seismic activity and proximity of larger cities. Merbabu, a volcano that remained quiet for centuries, is covered up to the top by soil and grass, bushes and plants. Our aim is to portray them. They help us to define the land of Java, not by its exterior contours, but from within those objects.
So the 17 volcanoes form territorial markers that allow us to interweave historical and contemporary narratives of Indonesia. As politically, economically, and culturally charged objects that act and behave in periodic cycles, these volcanoes are neither urban nor rural, neither alive nor dead, neither past nor present, neither good nor bad. Their ambiguous existence makes them particularly interesting for an architectural scrutiny. As objects of research, these volcanoes, or the volcano, allows us to overcome the dichotomy of urban versus land. It also helps us to shift the perspective that traditionally has its spatial and temporal point of origin within the urban and looks towards what is not or not yet urban. Yet neither are they a landscape in the sense of a passive backdrop or a resource to be colonized. Some of the rocks and sand that they produce are quarried and exploded, yes, but on the other hand, the potential of volcanoes is beyond control. When the Indonesian volcano of Tambora erupted in 1815, it changed the atmosphere of the entire planet, causing the following year in Europe to be a disastrous year without a summer. Clive Oppenheimer, volcanologist at Cambridge University and our travel companion on several expeditions, wrote a book about this phenomenon entitled Eruptions That Shook the Earth.
Volcanoes in general, and Vesuvius in particular, you might not see it, but it's an actual sketch by Friedrich Schinkel, have fascinated architects and artists since the 18th century. Vesuvius, from its eruption in antiquity that cost the life of Pliny the Elder, to its eruption in the wake of modernity that has affected modern art, architecture, and science. The European literature and art is intrinsically tied to the figure of Vesuvius. The poet Goethe, but also the architect Friedrich Schinkel, traveled there in order to witness the very source of the natural sublime. In the early 19th century, the area was difficult to access because of war. Alexander von Humboldt then had to take a substantial detour to South America in view of exploring the volcanoes of Peru. Besides the work of art and the accounts by Junghun and the works of Princeton and Linke, we also work together with the artist collective U5 in Switzerland. And from time to time, we also commission other kinds of work, such as the two very heavy sculptures made out of Merapi stone, which you can see outside in this exhibition. One is the interpretation of Mount Merapi by a local stone carver, who for all of his life worked with Merapi stone, but never ever before made a sculpture of the mountain itself. That was quite a novel experience for himself and for him too, and it was also like, you can also see the sculpture, it was not really, it was a kind of experiment for him. And the other one is a scale model of the so-called chicken church. It really exists in full scale, as you see here. An Indonesian version of Venturi's duck, which as a spiritual building is literally facing Mount Merapi. So wherever these two large souvenirs show up and travel to, they always locate themselves precisely in relation to one another, also to be observed here. These relational issues and questions of form and material certainly resonate with and have their motivation in fundamental architectural interests of us. Another one would be to introduce the idea of the volcano as an instance of a figure, which within the discussion of territory and our cultural landscape, to discuss mountains not as topography, but as culturally charged figures between sign, form, language, and image is analogous to understanding also buildings as such figures instead of simple containers. Suddenly, we can relate our volcanoes to ideas of architects such as John Haydock of philologists such as Erich Auerbach.
So the figure is one of the concepts that we bring into play and that we use in this research project. Another concept that we are interested in is the entry point. How can we enter a topic? Where is the point of access to a subject matter? Methodologically, this is a challenge, and our project has the ambition to bring the discussion further. In our narrative, the crater rim becomes such an entry point, an interface, a connecting place where the exterior and the interior of the Earth, so to speak, meet, a point of transition between the past, early eruptions that one can locate because of the scattered rocks, the present, and the future, what might be produced from the magma chambers in a depth of several kilometers. It's also a connector between the material and the immaterial, between solid matter and narration. There is a striking passage in one of Jung Hoon's books where he describes how he stands on the edge of Tangkuban Perahu, one of his favorite places near his home, in 1848, shortly before sailing back to Europe because of his illness. In his words, I quote, "Here, at the edge of the crater, I received the newspapers from Europe, which were brought mid-June to Batavia with the land mail. Revolution in Paris, hardly sensed and already ended. Republic proclaimed, Louis-Philippe fled. These were the news which were brought to us unexpectedly, like a fairy tale, and which stirred everybody also in Java. The excitement of the peoples resembled the electromagnetic force which moves around half the world with invisible speed. Later there came news from Bali, reform movements, political upheaval in Batavia, strange weather phenomena, smoke in the air, rain, floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, a comet, and back in Europe, war and revolution." End of quote. So Jung Hoon is obviously on the side of the revolutionaries and both excited and disappointed about the failed revolution in France. From a distance, he interconnects geological and political events, natural and cultural phenomena. These are precisely the techniques that we are trying to use, techniques that allow us to interconnect art, architecture, history, economy, science, literature. I hesitate to call this interdisciplinary, since the term has fallen into the hands of the administrators of higher education, and we should just leave it there. And also because each of the participants in our group, in a way, follows their own agenda. Each is expert in one field and dilettante in most other fields. This brings me to the third concept, the concept of the tourist. Volcanoes are key attractions not only for artists in Century, but also for tourists. In our own project, we do not categorically distinguish between the tourist and the researcher. We follow Dean McCannell, the pioneer of tourism study, who in his now classic book, The Tourist, A New Theory of the Leisure Class, 1976, calls the tourist, quote, "one of the best models available for modern man in general." According to McCannell, the tourist is synonymous with the modern middle-class subject, as he spends most of its money on stepping outside the production process for 2 weeks in order to watch others work. The tourist, as McCannell and we see it, should not be confounded with the tradition of the grand tour. The aristocratic tradition, going back to the 18th century, was mainly about individuals who did not have to work and had no limits in time when traveling. And of course, we also separate it categorically from the involuntary migration, which affects millions of people today who don't have the choice. Our concept of the tourist is intrinsically linked to the middle class. We depend on the institutional affiliation to the university system and on the grants given by the National Research Foundation. We are free to choose when and where to travel. Professional work and private leisure cannot be radically separated. Our expeditions are part of the tourism industry and use the same infrastructure, next please, as we would on holidays.
It's an unfair sequence.
And we, of course, find much pleasure in these travels. Jung-hoon becomes a figure of projection for the joy of exploration, the joy of creation, the next please, and the adventures of research.
Even more unfair.
On the other hand, tourism also makes different areas of the world comparable and exchangeable. One is never the first. There's always someone there, and there is no real exotic place. So in our narrative, Java is not exotic, but it's exemplary.
Mm-hmm. So the method of working in situ, of traveling in a small or larger group, goes back to many years of trips with students at ETH Zurich, our so-called seminar weeks. Every semester, each professor is obliged to offer such a trip. For us, these are never armchair travels, but performances in a certain way, where teaching and research meet and where we try not so much to follow what we already know, but to encounter what we don't know. Both our expeditions and exhibitions have the same purpose in this project. They are both means to advance the research in production and bringing all distinct parts closer together. After visiting Java, Jung-hoon's desired land, we decided to visit also his birthplace, the city of Mansfeld in the Harz. I guess nobody has ever been there in this room, except for us. It's in central Germany. The area happens to be not only the birthplace of Jung-hoon, but also the birthplace of German tourism, since the nearby Brocken, the Mount Brocken, between the late 18th century and the early 19th century, was both a symbol of national identity for Germany and a place to worship nature. The area became so popular that the landscape suffered and it was protected. In fact, that created the first nature reserve in Germany. But we did not only want to visit the area, but also do something. Together with the Berlin artist duo Wermke Leinkauf, who had become well known for the performance in New York, where they exchanged the American flag on the Brooklyn Bridge with a white flag, we made a non-monument for Franz Wilhelm Jung-hoon. The area, as you see here, is marked by copper mining, and the slag heaps recall, of course, volcanoes. So it was clear for us what to do. With a large group of students, armed with shovels, we made our way up these mountains, manipulated their peaks in a very specific way, got out of harm's way, waited in distance, and for a few seconds, it actually looked as if there was a real volcano erupting in East Germany. Even the news had the same idea of this thing. So this speculative mirage was over in no time. And the only remainder of this is the image of it, but still, such little autonomous facts help to construct and densify the overall narrative of this particular project.
So we're getting to the conclusion. This exhibition here in Montreal is the second venue after first venue that took place at ETH Zurich in spring. The exhibition is intended to be part of the research project, an experiment rather than a representation of the result. It allows us to share our ideas, to make accessible our question, to profit from hopefully your comments and critique. It will continue and travel to Singapore, to the National University of Singapore Museum. There we will try to involve the Singaporean students and have them produce the 16 missing stone volcanoes under the guidance of a Javanese sculptor. The show will also travel to the place where Jung-hoon worked, namely to the Bandung Institute of Technology in Bandung, Indonesia. In the end, we hope that it will travel to the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, currently under construction. Jung-hoon had, as most of his contemporary explorers, aspired to become like Humboldt, and it would be a perfect conclusion to see the fruit of his work as content of the new cultural center in Berlin. Once again, we are very grateful for the CCA to host this exhibition. Mirko Zardini and Giovanna Borasi's unexpected invitation is a privilege for us and our entire team. To be at CCA also means to be in the company of some of the most exciting architects of the past and the present, and to participate in a dialogue and a reflection on the very nature of architecture. We are very pleased to be here, and we are sure that Franz Wilhelm Junghun would be proud of us all, and also very glad that he can be here in Montreal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.